quiet decision. The morning sun was pale over Mountain View, spreading a soft gold light across the Google campus. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and coffee drifting from the cafe, where employees gathered in hushed conversations. The news had broken only hours ago. Elon Musk had announced the sudden termination of 10,000 workers from his company, a decision that sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley. Fear traveled like a silent current through every tech corridor. No one said it out loud, but everyone wondered who would be next. SundarPichai sat alone in his glass-walled office, staring at the early headlines flashing across his tablet. He had known Elon for years, respected his daring and ambition, yet the brutality of this move unsettled him. Sundar's calm face reflected in the screen, his dark eyes thoughtful. He understood the weight of leadership, the impossible balance between innovation and human cost. But he also knew something else. Fear could destroy creativity faster than failure ever could. He looked out the window where hundreds of employees were arriving, their faces clouded with uncertainty. Some scrolled anxiously through their phones. Others whispered about layoffs and stock prices. Sundar felt the quiet pressure building inside him. He knew this moment would define what kind of leader he truly was. Instead of calling an emergency board meeting like others expected, Sundar did something unusual. He closed his laptop, stood up slowly, and walked out of his office. No assistants followed him, no security, no cameras. He wanted to see his people, not as data points or performance metrics, but as humans, the beating heart behind every line of code and every dream that powered the company. In the cafeteria, conversation stopped when he entered. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, some curious, others fearful. Sundar gave a small nod, then picked up a simple paper cup of coffee. He sat down at a random table next to two interns who looked like they'd seen a ghost. "Morning," he said softly, his tone carrying warmth that eased the tension for a second. They hesitated before replying, their hands shaking slightly. One of them, a young woman named Maya, finally asked, "Sir, is it true? Are we next?" The question hung heavy in the air. Sundar didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. Then he leaned forward and said, "What if I told you that fear doesn't help us build anything? What if today we decide to do the opposite of what everyone expects?" The interns exchanged confused glances. Sundar smiled faintly. "Let's make today about people, not numbers." With that, he stood up and began walking through the building, stopping at desks, meeting eyes, shaking hands. He listened, really listened, to engineers, designers, janitors, and cafeteria workers. Each had worries about job security, families, rent, and health. Sundar carried their words silently like stones in his pocket. By midday, he had spoken with more than 50 employees. As he returned to his office, his assistant handed him a tablet filled with messages from investors. They wanted reassurance, cost-cutting, proof of efficiency. Sundar knew what they wanted to hear, but deep down, he knew what the company needed to hear instead. He gathered the senior leadership team that afternoon. The room buzzed with tension. Charts and graphs flickered on digital screens showing rising costs, declining margins, and forecasts that screamed for layoffs. One executive cleared his throat and said, "Sundar, we might need to follow Elon's lead. A reduction in force could stabilize things before year-end." Sundar didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room, his eyes calm but firm. "Do you all remember why we started? Do you remember the first time you searched for something online and found the answer in seconds? That feeling and that spark, it wasn't built by fear or profit margins. It was built by curiosity, by trust, by people who believed in what we do." Another executive sighed. "But the shareholders will survive," Sundar interrupted gently. "But will we still be us if we abandon what we stand for?" The room fell silent. The glow of the monitors painted everyone's faces in pale blue light. Sundar stood and walked to the window again. Outside, employees gathered in small groups waiting for answers. "I won't fire anyone," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Not one." A few gasps escaped around the table. One manager frowned. "You can't be serious. The market will react." "The board might." "Let them react," Sundar said. "We will respond with something stronger than fear. We will invest in our people." By evening, an email went out to every employee. It wasn't drafted by the communications team or filtered through legal. Sundar wrote it himself, simple, direct from his heart. He wrote that while others were cutting jobs, Google would double down on innovation and internal learning. Instead of layoffs, he was launching a new initiative, a paid program where employees could develop new ideas, explore sustainability projects, or help small startups grow using Google tools. It was called the Phoenix Project because in times of crisis he believed people could rise again. The message spread like wildfire. Disbelief turned into hope. Across offices from New York to Tokyo, employees cheered. Social media filled with posts praising Sundar's decision. Investors were confused, some angry. But Sundar didn't respond to the noise. He just walked home quietly that night, his hands in his pockets watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. When he reached home, his wife Anjali greeted him at the door. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes and asked softly, "You did what you believed, didn't you?" Sundar smiled faintly. "I did what felt right." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then whatever happens next, you'll face it with peace." He nodded, but deep down, he knew the hardest part was still to come. Because the next morning his phone would ring with a call from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end would change everything. The call that changed everything. The next morning broke quietly over the San Francisco Bay, the sky painted with faint streaks of rose and orange. Sundar sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of steaming chai, his thoughts wandering between relief and uncertainty. He had slept little, though his heart felt calm about the decision not to fire anyone. The silence of the markets that morning carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He knew that when a leader moved against the current, the waves always pushed back harder. As he scrolled through early financial reports, his phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed across the screen. He hesitated for a moment, then answered softly. "Hello, this is Sundar." A deep voice replied, "Sundar, it's Elon." For a moment the world seemed to slow. He hadn't expected the call to come so soon, and certainly not from the man whose decision had just shaken the global tech industry. Sundar's tone remained calm. "Good morning, Elon. How are you?" Elon's voice carried that familiar blend of confidence and restlessness. "You really decided not to cut anyone, huh? You know what that's going to cost you, right?" Sundar leaned back, staring out the window at the sunlight cutting through the fog. "I know, but what you did yesterday cost something too. Something you can't measure in dollars." There was a pause on the line. Sundar could almost hear Elon smirking, sentimental as always. "You think kindness will save you in this game?" "It won't. Efficiency wins." "Maybe," Sundar said quietly, "but humanity builds the future. Without it, even efficiency collapses." The call ended without a goodbye. Sundar set the phone down and exhaled deeply. It wasn't anger he felt. It was a kind of sadness, a recognition that two visions of the world were now diverging, one driven by speed and control, the other by patience and trust. He had chosen the harder path, and he knew it. By noon, the consequences arrived. The company's stock began to dip. News outlets questioned his leadership. Analysts filled panels with bold predictions. "Google risks investor revolt," one headline read. Social media exploded with divided opinions. Some called Sundar naive, others hailed him as courageous. Through it all, Sundar stayed silent. He refused interviews, declined comment requests, and focused on what mattered most in his people. That afternoon, he walked into the open workspace of a small team working on accessibility tools for the visually impaired. The lead engineer, a quiet woman named Anita, looked up nervously when he entered. "Sir, we were just discussing if we'll have to pause our project." Sundar smiled gently. "No, you'll accelerate it. Tell me what you need." Her eyes widened. "Really? But funding, we'll find a way," he interrupted softly. "We always do when the work matters." As he listened to Anita describe their prototype, a voice interface that could read emotions in tone and adjust responses for people with vision challenges, he felt something awaken in him. This was why he refused to cut jobs. Innovation didn't live in spreadsheets. It lived in hearts like these, in minds unafraid to dream even in uncertain times. That night he stayed late in the office. Most lights had gone out, leaving only the faint hum of servers and the occasional reflection of the city skyline on the glass. He walked through the silent corridors, thinking about the path ahead. Every great decision, he realized, came with loneliness, but loneliness was sometimes the birthplace of greatness. He stopped by the break room and found Maya, the intern he had spoken to the day before, sitting there, staring at her laptop. She looked startled when she saw him. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't expect anyone here." Sundar smiled. "Working late?" She nodded shyly. "I just wanted to write a thank you email to my parents." They were so scared I'd lose my internship. I told them about your message. It gave them hope. He sat across from her. Hope is powerful, Maya. It keeps the lights on when the world feels dark. Maya hesitated before speaking again. Sir, do you ever get scared? The question caught him off guard. He thought for a long moment before answering. Every day. But I've learned that courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about walking forward even when fear follows you. She smiled faintly. Then I guess I'll try to walk forward too. As Sundar left the office, her words stayed with him. Sometimes the most profound truths came from unexpected places. The next morning, a headline surprised everyone. Google employees volunteer to work for free to support the Phoenix Project. Hundreds of workers across the world had signed a collective pledge. If the company faced financial strain, they'd temporarily donate their hours to keep innovation alive. The story spread faster than any corporate press release. People admired the unity. Competitors, baffled by the act, didn't know how to respond. The world was watching now. Even Elon's companies faced internal murmurs. Employees questioning whether compassion might be the stronger force after all. But amid the growing praise, Sundar remained focused. He didn't crave applause. What mattered was that the idea, the belief in kindness as strength, had begun to take root. One evening, as he returned home, his wife met him at the door holding a letter. This came today, she said. No return address. Sundar opened it carefully. Inside was a single page handwritten in neat lines. It read, "You don't know me, but I was one of the engineers Elon let go. I wanted to thank you. Your words yesterday made me believe again. I'm starting something new, an education startup for laid-off workers. We're calling it Rise. Maybe someday our paths will cross." Beneath the signature was a small phrase that made Sundar pause. Because of your decision, hope didn't die everywhere. He folded the letter slowly, feeling the quiet emotion rise in his chest. He walked outside and looked up at the stars beginning to flicker. The world was still vast, uncertain, and full of noise. But somewhere out there, people were rebuilding because one person refused to follow fear. As the cool wind brushed against his face, Sundar closed his eyes. He didn't know what the next day would bring, whether the board would stand with him or turn against him, but he knew he couldn't go back now. The choice had already been made, and it was larger than him. And when his phone buzzed again that night, it wasn't Elon this time. It was a private message from one of the board members. "We need to talk tomorrow morning," it said. "Things are moving faster than you think." The boardroom storm. The morning sky was gray when Sundar arrived at the office, the kind of color that seemed to drain warmth from everything it touched. The air was heavier than usual, and the silence in the main corridor felt unnatural. Employees who usually greeted him with smiles looked down instead, their whispers dying the moment he passed. He understood immediately. Something had shifted overnight. As he approached the top floor, he noticed 2 security officers stationed by the boardroom door. They nodded respectfully but didn't smile. Inside, the entire leadership council was already seated. The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Sundar took his seat at the head of the table, facing the board members whose faces were lit by the glow of digital reports. The chairman, a stern man named Robert, cleared his throat. "Sundar, I'll get straight to the point. The stock fell 6% yesterday. Investors are calling for an emergency correction plan." Sundar folded his hands calmly. "I'm aware. And I believe short-term reactions don't define long-term success." Robert frowned. "That's easy to say when you're not holding the company's capital in your hands. Your decision not to cut staff might sound noble, but nobility doesn't pay dividends." The room fell silent. Sundar's voice was soft when he replied, "You're right, nobility doesn't, but trust does. And if we destroy that trust now, no dividend will matter in a year." One of the board members, an older woman named Elena, leaned forward. "You've built your entire career on logic, Sundar. Why are you suddenly leading with emotion?" He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Because logic without empathy becomes cruelty, and I refuse to let that define our legacy." A murmur rippled across the table. Robert slammed his pen down. "Legacy doesn't matter if the company collapses." "Then we rebuild," Sundar said simply. "With people who believe in what we're building." The chairman stared at him, speechless. The quiet confidence in Sundar's tone carried more power than any argument could. Finally, Robert sighed and leaned back. "You're walking a fine line. If this backfires, it's on you." Sundar nodded. "I accept that." After the meeting, he stood alone at the window overlooking the campus. The clouds had thickened and rain began to fall in soft, steady lines. He thought of every employee counting on him, not just for a paycheck, but for faith that leadership could still mean compassion. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, but steadier too. That afternoon, an unexpected email arrived. It was from Elon again. Subject still standing. The message was short. Heard about your stock dip. Courage looks expensive, doesn't it? Let's see how long you last. Sundar read it twice, then closed his laptop. A faint smile crossed his face. Courage was expensive, yes. But fear had cost the world far more. He spent the next few days moving quietly through departments, encouraging teams, asking for ideas. A group of engineers approached him with a concept for a sustainability platform that would allow small towns to map carbon emissions using simple tools. Another group proposed an AI tutor that could provide free personalized education in developing countries. Instead of rejecting their dreams for being unprofitable, Sundar listened, invested, and gave them space to create. His assistant, Rajiv, noticed the change. One evening, as they walked out of the office together, he asked softly, "Sir, you really believe kindness can compete with fear?" Sundar smiled faintly. "I don't think they compete. I think kindness endures longer." News about the Phoenix Project continued to spread. Journalists began writing new stories, not about falling stocks, but about rising morale. Employees at other tech giants started posting videos saying they wished their leaders thought like Sundar. Students in India wrote letters to Google thanking the company for restoring their faith in humanity within technology. One evening, Sundar was invited to speak at a live-streamed leadership conference. Thousands of viewers tuned in. He stood before the audience, hands folded gently, his expression calm yet deeply human. "We're living in a time," he said slowly, "when technology moves faster than our empathy. But if we stop seeing people behind the data, we lose the very soul of progress. Leadership isn't about control, it's about care. And sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is refuse to follow the crowd." The audience erupted in applause. Yet as the lights dimmed, Sundar knew the applause wasn't the end. It was only the calm before the next wave. Because somewhere across the city, a group of investors was already meeting privately, planning to challenge his decision publicly at the upcoming shareholder meeting. Late that night, Sundar returned home. His wife Anjali met him with quiet concern. "You've been fighting storms all week. Are you sure you're not burning yourself out?" He smiled tiredly. "Maybe. But sometimes the fire inside is what keeps you standing through the storm." She handed him a small box. Inside was a wristwatch he had once left behind years ago during his early engineering days in India. "A reminder," she said softly, "of how far humility can carry you." He held it in his palm, the old leather strap worn and familiar. "Thank you," he whispered. The next morning, when Sundar walked into the office wearing that same watch, it caught the attention of one of the janitors. "Sir, that looks old," the man said with a grin. "It is," Sundar replied, "and it still works perfectly. Just needs care, not replacement." The janitor nodded thoughtfully, not realizing that those simple words carried the essence of Sundar's leadership. But as the day ended, an email from the board appeared in his inbox marked urgent. "Sundar, we've been contacted by the Investors Alliance. They're demanding your resignation. The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow." He stared at the screen, the rain tapping softly against the glass outside. For the first time in years, a shadow of doubt passed through him. He knew that by this time tomorrow, everything he had fought for could vanish. But as the night deepened, he whispered to himself, "You can take the title away, but not the truth behind it." And with that, he turned off the lights, ready to face whatever awaited him at dawn. The shareholders' reckoning. The sun hadn't yet risen when Sundar woke that morning, his mind already heavy with the weight of the coming hours. Outside, the world was still. No birdsong, no wind, only the faint hum of the city beyond the hills. He dressed in silence, buttoning his shirt slowly as if every movement anchored him to the present. Anjali watched him from the doorway, worry clouding her face. "It's today, isn't it?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes. The shareholders want answers. Or maybe they just want a target." She stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. "Then give them truth. That's the only weapon that never rusts." He smiled faintly. Her calmness reminded him why he still believed in kindness. Because in a world built on noise and numbers, empathy was the last quiet thing that still mattered. By mid-morning, the company auditorium was filled. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready. Investors from around the world joined the stream. their faces appearing on large digital screens that glowed above the stage. The atmosphere was sharp, electric, heavy with expectation. Sundar walked onto the stage, not in a designer suit or polished tie, but in a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Whispers rippled through the crowd. He didn't carry notes. He didn't have a teleprompter. He stood behind the podium, took a deep breath, and looked directly into the rows of restless faces. "Good morning," he began softly. "I know many of you are here today because you're worried. About profit, about numbers, about the future of this company. I share that worry. But I also share something bigger: responsibility." A man from the front row interrupted sharply. "Responsibility doesn't pay our losses, Mr. Pichai. Your decision cost us millions." Sundar didn't flinch. "Yes," he said, "it did. But it also saved something worth more than millions. It saved trust, it saved innovation, and it saved people. And without people, no company, no matter how large, it can survive." Murmurs spread through the room. One of the board members leaned into the microphone. "Sundar, we respect your idealism, but our job is to protect the company's value. We cannot run a business on moral sentiment." Sundar's eyes softened, but his tone turned steady, almost firm. "You're wrong. Every lasting business is built on moral sentiment, on purpose. When we forget that, we may grow fast, but we crumble just as quickly." He clicked a small remote. The screen behind him lit up, not with financial charts, but with faces. Hundreds of faces: employees, janitors, engineers, cafeteria workers, teachers from schools using Google's tools for free learning programs. One video showed an engineer with tears in her eyes, saying when the world was firing people, he reminded us we mattered. Another clip showed a laid-off worker from another company, now teaching coding to children using free Google resources. The room grew silent. Even the angriest shareholders seemed momentarily disarmed. Sundar let the silence breathe before speaking again. "This is what you built," he said softly. "This is what your investment created. Not just returns, but impact. This is our real currency, the one that doesn't crash." A young investor, visibly emotional, stood up. "But the stock still fell," she said, her voice uncertain. "Stocks fall," Sundar replied, "but values rise. I didn't become CEO to chase numbers. I became one to remind the world that technology can have a heart." The audience sat in stunned quiet. Somewhere in the back, a camera shutter clicked softly, the sound that would later travel across the world as the defining image of that day. But not everyone was convinced. Robert, the chairman, leaned forward, his tone colder now. "Your speech is poetic, Sundar. But shareholders vote with results, not feelings. We are putting your leadership to a vote. If the majority believes your actions are unsustainable, you will be asked to step down immediately." A collective murmur filled the room. Sundar stood still, his face calm, his voice unwavering. "If that's what you believe is right, then so be it. But before you vote, I ask only one thing. Look beyond your balance sheets. Look at the people who trusted us with their livelihoods, their time, their faith. Ask yourselves, are we leading for quarters or for generations?" The question hung in the air like a slow echo. The vote began. One by one, names appeared on the screen. Approve, remove, abstain. For a moment, Sundar's heart pounded louder than the murmurs. He thought of every face he had seen since that morning when he chose compassion over convenience. He thought of Maya, the intern, Anita, the engineer, the janitor who had smiled about his old watch. He thought of his children, of the kind of world they might inherit from the choices he made today. The tally board flickered. One side began to rise. Remove climbed fast. Then approve began to catch up. Tension rippled across the room. Every second felt like a lifetime. And then, silence. The final result appeared. Approval, 52%; removal, 48%. The room erupted into mixed reactions, gasps, applause, disbelief. Sundar didn't smile. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, whispering under his breath, "Thank you." When the noise died down, he looked up and said, "You haven't just kept me in this role. You've chosen the harder path with me. And for that, I promise we will build something that will outlast us all." The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, steady, and deeply sincere. But amid the clapping, Robert leaned toward Elena and whispered something Sundar couldn't hear. And later that evening, as Sundar walked alone through the quiet halls of the company, a message flashed on his phone. Unknown sender. It read, "You won today. But tomorrow they'll come for something deeper than your position. Be ready. He stared at it, the glow of the screen reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. He slipped the phone into his pocket and whispered to himself, "Then let them come." Outside, lightning flashed in the distance, splitting the sky, a warning that the storm was far from over. The unseen storm. The following week began with an eerie calm. The media called Sundar's survival a miracle. Analysts debated it endlessly, and employees celebrated quietly in the hallways. For a brief moment, the campus buzzed with hope again. But beneath the surface, Sundar felt something darker stirring, an unease he couldn't explain. It wasn't about the vote anymore. It was something else, something silent, waiting. That Monday morning, he arrived earlier than usual. The sky over Mountain View was a pale gray, heavy with clouds, and the glass buildings reflected it like cold mirrors. As he walked through the lobby, the security guard greeted him with a nervous smile. "Sir, there was an incident last night. Someone tried to breach the server wing. Nothing major, but strange," Sundar frowned. "Strange how?" The guard hesitated. "No damage, but whoever it was left a note. Just 2 words. Stop this." Sundar felt a chill move through him. "Send it to my office," he said quietly. He spent the next few hours reviewing security footage, talking to his team, trying to understand if it was a protest, a hack, or something more personal. There were no fingerprints, no entry records, no trace on the cameras, as if the message had appeared out of thin air. He went about his day as usual, though his thoughts lingered. He spoke to engineers, reviewed project proposals, and attended meetings for the Phoenix Initiative, which was now expanding globally. Yet even as he smiled and nodded, a quiet tension shadowed him. Every movement around him felt sharper, every whisper, every glance. That evening, he received a call from Elena, the board member who had once questioned his emotional leadership. Her voice was low, cautious. "Sundar, there's something you should know. Not everyone who voted for you did so with good intentions. Some of them want to push you into failure, publicly." "Why?" he asked softly. "Because if you fail while standing for compassion," she said, "they can say it proves that kindness doesn't work." Her words hung in his mind long after the call ended. He stared out at the city lights, wondering how leadership had turned into a war of ideologies. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the empty house, the hum of appliances filling the silence. Anjali found him standing by the window, lost in thought. "You're thinking about the message again," she said gently. "Someone wants me to stop," he replied, "but I can't tell if they're warning me or threatening me." She stepped closer, her voice firm. "Maybe it's a sign that what you're doing matters more than they want to admit." The next day brought news that changed everything. An internal whistleblower leaked partial financial data to the media, twisting it to make it appear that the Phoenix project was losing millions. Headlines screamed across the internet. Pichai's idealism backfires, a company in freefall. Social media turned vicious. Pundits mocked his compassion as weakness. Stock prices wavered again. Within hours, hashtags calling for his resignation began trending. Inside the company, panic spread like wildfire. Employees who had once stood proudly by him now looked uncertain. The board convened an emergency meeting. Robert, the chairman, was furious. "You've become a liability," he snapped across the table. "Whatever moral crusade you're on, it's bleeding us dry." Sundar didn't raise his voice. "The leak is misleading. The initiative isn't about quarterly gain. It's about creating long-term human capital." Robert slammed his palm against the desk. "We don't trade in human capital, we trade in results." Sundar's calm expression didn't waver. "And that," he said slowly, "is why so many companies lose their soul." There was silence again, a cold, brittle silence that felt like a wall between 2 worlds. After the meeting, he returned to his office and found Maya, the young intern, waiting by the door. She held a folder close to her chest. "Sir, I think I know who leaked the data," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her gently. "You don't have to get involved in this, Maya." "But I already am," she said. "You once told me courage is walking even when fear follows you." So here I am. Inside the folder were emails, timestamps, and traces of digital manipulation. The leak had been orchestrated, not by a rival company, but by an internal consultant hired by the board itself to sabotage the Phoenix project from within. For a long time, Sundar said nothing. Then quietly he whispered, "So it's true? They're trying to prove humanity wrong. Maya looked at him, eyes filled with worry. What will you do? He smiled faintly, the kind of smile born not from confidence but from conviction. I'll do what they don't expect. I'll forgive them. She blinked, stunned. Forgive them? After everything? Yes, he said softly. Because the moment I start fighting them with their own weapons, I become them. That night, Sundar called a press conference. Not to defend himself, but to tell the truth. When he stepped onto the stage, the world was watching again. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. His voice was steady as he began to speak. Mistakes have been made, he said, but not in our values, in our understanding of what truly sustains innovation. I stand by every person we've kept, every dream we've funded, and every risk we've taken to keep humanity at the center of technology. I won't resign because this was never about me. It's about proving that leadership built on empathy can survive in a world built on fear. The silence that followed was thick, almost sacred, and then something unexpected happened. Employees began walking into the hall behind him one by one. Engineers, designers, janitors, chefs, all wearing simple badges that read, "We are the Phoenix." Within minutes, the stage filled with hundreds of them. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the cameras captured the image. Sundar standing quietly among his people, surrounded by the very workforce he had refused to abandon. Across social media, the tide began to turn again. People saw not a CEO fighting for power, but a leader standing for purpose. Hashtags that once demanded resignation now read, "Lead with kindness." Journalists began rewriting their stories. Analysts admitted they had underestimated the power of collective faith. As the crowd cheered, Sundar looked up toward the lights, his heart steady for the first time in weeks. He had weathered the storm not by fighting it, but by walking through it with open hands. But as he returned backstage, his phone buzzed again. A new message from that same unknown sender. For now, they cheer. But when the light fades, shadows grow. The real test hasn't begun. Sundar stared at it for a long moment, the noise of the crowd fading behind him. He slipped the phone away and whispered to himself, "Then let the test come." Because somewhere deep inside, he already understood. This wasn't just a fight for a company anymore. It was a fight for what leadership meant in a world losing its heart. The light that never fades the next morning dawned with a strange stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The previous night's images of Sundar standing with his employees had spread across the globe. Newspapers called it the moment that redefined leadership, while social media overflowed with messages of gratitude and admiration. Yet amid all the noise, Sundar felt something deeper, an awareness that calm often came just before the final storm. He arrived at the office early, walking past employees who smiled warmly and thanked him in quiet voices. They looked different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of uncertainty had lifted from their shoulders. Still deep inside, he knew the struggle wasn't over. There were forces that didn't thrive on unity or compassion. They thrived on control. When he reached his office, he found an envelope waiting on his desk, unmarked, sealed with a faint imprint of the company logo. Inside was a single line typed in black ink. "You have 48 hours before the board moves to dissolve the Phoenix project permanently." He sat in silence for a moment, staring at the paper. The words didn't shock him. They confirmed what he had sensed all along. Some of the board members hadn't accepted their defeat. They were regrouping quietly, strategically. This time, they wouldn't come for his title. They would come for his vision. By afternoon, a new meeting was called. The boardroom felt colder than usual, the blinds drawn halfway, muting the light. Robert sat across from Sundar, his tone measured but sharp. "We've reviewed the data. The Phoenix project has emotional appeal, but little financial return. We're voting to end it." Sundar looked around the room at the men and women who had once believed in numbers more than purpose. "You think ending it will fix the stock price?" he asked quietly. Robert crossed his arms. "It will stabilize the company." Sundar nodded slowly. "Maybe, but at what cost? Every person who believed in us will see that our promises meant nothing. Every dreamer who looked up to this company will stop believing that humanity can exist in business." Elena, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What if he's right?" she said softly. "What if stability without trust is just another form of failure?" The room went still. Robert glared at her but didn't respond. Sundar stood, his voice steady. "You can vote today. You can take away my project, maybe even my position. But you can't take away what this has already become. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than this company. He walked out before they could respond. Behind him the murmurs began, some angry, some uncertain. He didn't need to hear the outcome. He already knew. That evening, as he drove home, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windshield like the world's quiet applause. When he reached his house, Anjali was waiting by the window. She turned and smiled sadly. They took it, didn't they? He nodded. They dissolved the project. And how do you feel? She asked. He thought for a long moment, then said, free, because they can dissolve the structure but not the spirit. The next day, Sundar sent a message to all employees. It wasn't formal or corporate. It was human, raw, honest, hopeful. He wrote, Phoenix wasn't a project. It was a promise. And promises don't end when meetings do. If what we built matters to you, then carry it beyond these walls. Help one person, one idea, one community at a time. Build what others are afraid to build, because even if leadership changes, purpose doesn't die. Within hours, the message spread across the company. People began forwarding it to friends, families, even competitors. Hashtags flooded social platforms again. Rise again. Lead with kindness. The Phoenix lives. 3 days later, something extraordinary happened. Independent teams of former and current employees began launching their own versions of the Phoenix Initiative. Volunteer-driven, non-profit, community-powered projects.
One group in India started an educational network for rural children using old laptops refurbished through Google's sustainability centers.
Another team in Kenya created a local translation platform to help small businesses reach global customers. One engineer wrote, "He taught us that leadership isn't about command. It's about ignition, lighting something inside people that keeps burning long after you leave." The movement grew faster than any corporate campaign ever had. News outlets called it the rebirth of purpose, and somewhere in a quiet corner office, Sundar sat watching it unfold. His heart was calm, but his eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. One evening, as he left work, he found Maya waiting outside the building. She handed him a small notebook. "These are letters," she said softly, "from employees all over the world. They wanted to thank you." He smiled gently. "Thank us, Maya. This was never about me alone." She shook her head. "Maybe not. But someone has to be the first to believe, before the rest can follow." Sundar opened the notebook later that night. Inside were hundreds of handwritten messages. One read, "You reminded us that a company's worth isn't measured by its stock, but by its soul." Another simply said, "You made us proud to be human again." He closed the notebook slowly, looking out the window at the faint glow of the city skyline. In the distance, the lights shimmered through the rain, countless small flames burning against the dark. And he realized that the Phoenix Project hadn't been destroyed. It had transformed, spreading its wings into the world, no longer bound by walls or contracts. Weeks later, he received another letter, handwritten, just like the one before. It was from the same engineer who had written to him months ago, the one who started the Rise education startup. It said, "We just launched our first school. 20 kids, one old building, zero fear. We call it Phoenix 1. Thank you for reminding us that every fall is just a new beginning." Sundar smiled quietly as he folded the letter and placed it in his drawer beside his old watch. A symbol of time that endures, no matter how the world changes. The next morning, he stood outside the Google campus, the air fresh after rain. Employees passed by, laughing, hopeful, carrying coffee cups and laptops, unaware, perhaps, that they were walking through history. Sundar took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Sometimes to build something that lasts, you have to let it burn first." And as he turned to leave, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the campus with warm, golden light. It glinted off the glass buildings, off the trees, off the watch on his wrist, and a final reminder that no storm, however fierce, could extinguish the quiet flame of conviction. Because the true Phoenix was never a project or a company or a leader. It was the belief that in a world obsessed with power, compassion could still rise, count again and again, from the ashes.